In a quiet, snow-covered town in America, an elderly woman walks into a diner, just looking for warmth, maybe a hot meal. No one knows. She once faced down an armed gunman to save a classroom full of children. No one remembers. She spent 40 years teaching this very community how to read, how to think, how to care. But today, two young female officers humiliate her in front of everyone, mock her, handcuff her, like she's nothing but a nuisance to be removed. What they didn't know was that one trembling phone call from a young waiter would ignite a national firestorm, that the woman they tried to erase had once saved the life of a now 4-star general, the same general who now runs the Pentagon. This is the story of a teacher who never stopped teaching a community that tried to silence her, and a nation that had to reckon with its own conscience. One woman, one arrest, and a chain reaction that would shake the entire system. Snow floated lazily through the air, softening the hard edges of Frostbridge, Pennsylvania, as dusk turned to night. The town's modest buildings, brick-faced and washed in amber streetlight, huddled together against the cold like secrets unwilling to speak. Most people had already retreated into their homes, fireplaces crackling, doors locked. But one figure moved slowly, deliberately through the pale hush of falling snow. Wrapped in a faded green coat that had once been school-issued Mrs. Nadine Holloway, 70 years old, former elementary school teacher and now quietly forgotten, walked with a kind of dignity that defied her worn boots and weathered hands. She carried a paper bag clutched to her chest, not filled with food or gifts, but with the tattered remnants of her past, a framed classroom photo, a thank you note from a child named Amelia, and her expired faculty ID, which no one accepted anymore. She paused at the corner of 5th and Maple, where a red neon sign buzzed weekly, "Maple Diner, open 24 hours." Through the frosted glass, warmth glowed like an invitation from a world that had long since shut her out. Inside, she could make out silhouettes, people laughing, sipping coffee, families sharing meals. Nadine's stomach ached quietly. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days. Her modest pension barely covered her medication. But tonight she had just enough to buy a plate of something hot, perhaps the meatloaf special, if they hadn't raised the price again. She straightened her spine out of habit. Years of teaching had conditioned her to present herself not as a victim, but as an example, and wiped the snow from her coat sleeves. She pushed open the door. A bell jingled softly overhead, and a wave of heat, grease, and chatter enveloped her. And then everything stopped. The clinking of forks on plates stilled. Conversations halted. Heads turned. A woman at a corner booth pulled her daughter closer. A man in a business coat shifted uncomfortably, patting his wallet before tucking it deeper into his pocket. The air seemed to thicken with a kind of silent shared assumption that she did not belong here. Nadine felt it all as she always did, but she said nothing. She moved with poise toward the counter, choosing a stool, not because it was closest, but because it gave her a clear view of both exits, an instinct developed not from paranoia, but from years of experience knowing that people like her often had to leave quickly. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands and glanced up at the chalkboard menu. Tuesday special, it read. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans roll, $8. A quiet voice broke through the hum of judgment. "Good evening, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" The server was young, no more than 25, with warm brown eyes and a hesitant kindness in his voice. Raymond Miller, his name tag read. She nodded gently. "Coffee black. And the special, if that's all right." She replied, her voice soft but eloquent, the cadence of a teacher still echoing in her words. "Of course, ma'am," Raymond said. "Coming right up." From the booth in the back, 2 female police officers, Sergeant Brenda Hill and Officer Kelly Monroe, watched the exchange with smirks curled like snakes in the corners of their mouths. They'd seen Nadine before, wandering the library steps, resting at the bus stop, with her worn tote bag speaking softly to herself. They never saw a teacher, a mentor, a woman who once stood between a gunman and a classroom full of children. No, they saw an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. Brenda raised an eyebrow and muttered just loud enough to carry across the room, "Better count the silverware, Raymond. Looks like your local stray wandered in again." Laughter, low cruel, rippled through a nearby booth. Kelly added, "Be sure to check the bathroom when she leaves. Old ones like her love to pocket things." Nadine's hand curled around her coffee mug, tensed just slightly. She didn't turn, she didn't speak, but in her eyes something ancient and unshakable stirred, something that had once calmed a classroom during a tornado drill, something that had once faced down a man with a weapon in a third-grade hallway. She didn't need to defend herself, not here, not to them. Raymond glanced over nervously flushed with embarrassment, but said nothing. Years of working under this town's silent rules had taught him that good intentions could come at high prices. Still, something in him shifted. Something that had been dormant. As he returned to the kitchen, he pressed record on his phone and slid it into his apron pocket. Back at the booth, Kelly stood and made a show of stretching. Her badge caught the overhead light as she swaggered toward the counter. She took the stool beside Nadine, legs wide, arms folded, the image of authority armed with contempt. "Well, well," she said brightly. "Didn't know we were running a charity tonight." Nadine sipped her coffee, eyes still on the far window. "I paid for my meal." "You sure it wasn't with food stamps?" Kelly said. "Or do we call that veterans discount?" "Now?" "Oh wait, teachers don't get medals, do they?" Raymond returned with the food hands shaking slightly as he set the plate down. "Meatloaf special. Enjoy, ma'am." "Thank you, Raymond," Nadine said clearly, kindly. Then turning slowly to face Kelly, for the first time she added, "You know, in my classroom, I taught children how to speak with dignity. Pity no one ever taught you." The silence that followed was dense and trembling. Kelly's smile vanished. Brenda, now standing, called out, "All right, ma'am, time to leave." "I haven't broken any laws," Nadine said, "and I haven't finished my meal." "You're disturbing the peace." "I'm disturbing your prejudice," she replied calmly. "Not the same thing." Brenda's hand twitched near her belt. "Stand up. Now." And that was when Raymond did something unexpected. He stepped between them. "She's done nothing wrong," he said, voice shaking but firm. "And I've got it all recorded." Brenda's eyes narrowed. Nadine looked up at him, not with surprise, but with something deeper, the quiet approval of a teacher recognizing that the student had at last found his voice. As the standoff simmered and the diner held its breath, Nadine whispered one sentence to Raymond, a sentence that would ignite a firestorm across Frostbridge and far beyond. "If anything happens to me, call General Margaret Whitaker in D.C. Tell her Mrs. Nadine Holloway is in trouble." Raymond blinked. "General, what?" But he nodded. And somewhere in the snowy silence outside, the wind shifted. Everything was about to change. Raymond stood frozen behind the counter, Nadine's words echoing in his ears like a code from a spy film, surreal yet undeniable in their weight. "Call General Margaret Whitaker." He didn't know any generals, didn't even know if that was a real person. But something about the way she said it, calm, certain, like reciting the final line of a vow, made him instinctively believe her. Brenda and Kelly, however, did not share that faith. Brenda stepped forward with the slow menace of someone used to not being questioned, her hand resting casually near her taser, her tone honey-slick and condescending. "Come on, Holloway, let's not make a scene," she said, as though the scene hadn't already been made, as though the stares from the other patrons weren't sharp with discomfort and fear. Nadine didn't flinch. She folded her napkin with deliberate grace, placed it beside her half-eaten plate, and looked Brenda straight in the eye. "If you lay hands on me without cause, you'll answer for it," Kelly snorted from behind her partner. "Answer to who? God, Oprah." "Your old PTA board." Nadine's response was a slow blink, as if she were already beyond them, already thinking 3 moves ahead. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, and the quiet certainty in her voice made even Brenda hesitate, but only for a second. With a grunt, Brenda seized Nadine's wrist, not roughly but firmly, and began to pull her from the stool. Raymond's phone trembled in his apron pocket as it continued to record. Nadine didn't resist. She allowed herself to be escorted through the diner like a relic being discarded, though her shoulders remained unbowed and her gait steady. Patrons watched, but said nothing. A few looked away. One man raised his phone briefly, then lowered it, uncertain. Raymond followed behind them, steps tentative, unsure whether he was about to be fired, arrested, or worse. As they exited into the night, the cold hit them like a slap. Snow clung to Nadine's hair like a crown. Brenda opened the cruiser door, while Kelly shoved Nadine toward it. The old woman stumbled slightly but regained her footing with a quiet dignity that shamed the wind. Then something happened. As Kelly leaned in to frisk her, Nadine's necklace snapped, the chain brittle from age, and something metallic clattered to the ground. A key. No, not a key. A thin, polished tag, old military style, with engraving barely visible beneath frost. Kelly stepped on it. "Oops," she sneered. "Looks like Grandma dropped her retirement badge." Raymond, now only a few feet away, bent down before they could stop him, and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. He wiped the snow away and read the text, Holloway N. Educator Emergency Response Unit, 1996. It didn't make sense what was an educator doing with a federal-style ID tag. Brenda saw him staring. Step away from police business, Miller, she warned, unless you want to be out of a job and behind a bench. But Raymond, for the first time in his life, didn't step back. I'm calling someone, he said quietly. She asked me to. And before they could react, he turned and ran back inside the diner, pulling his phone from his apron, heart pounding in his chest. The number Nadine had whispered to him he hadn't realized until now had already been saved in her last receipt, scribbled in pen on the back of a napkin under the words, "In case the past finds me." He dialed. 1 ring, 2, 3, then Department of Defense. "This is Sergeant Langston. How may I direct your call?" Raymond's voice cracked. I need to speak to General Margaret Whitaker. It's about, he looked through the diner window as the cruiser's door slammed shut on Nadine's silhouette. It's about Nadine Holloway. She's in trouble. There was a pause, a very long pause. Then, please hold. 3,000 miles away, in a mahogany-paneled office inside the Pentagon, General Margaret Whitaker paused mid-sentence as her aide. A young lieutenant with sharp eyes and perfect posture leaned in and whispered something that drained the color from her face faster than any battlefield report ever had. She stood slowly, the briefing packet in her hand, forgotten her expression, shifting from composed authority to haunted urgency. "Put him through," she said, and within seconds Raymond's hesitant voice came through the secure line, crackling slightly with the tension of what he had just witnessed. "General Whitaker," he said, stumbling over the formality. "My name is Raymond Miller. I'm calling from Frostbridge, Pennsylvania. A woman named Nadine Holloway said I should contact you if something happened to her. She's just been taken by 2 officers, Brenda Hill and Kelly Monroe. I don't know where they're taking her." For a moment there was only silence on the line, thick and pulsing with memory. And then came the general's voice, low, calm, and utterly unshakable. "You did the right thing, Mr. Miller. Listen carefully. I need the exact address of the diner and the precinct where those officers report. Can you send that to my aide right now?" Raymond stammered a yes, hands trembling as he typed. "What's happening?" he asked. "Who is she really?" The general's eyes burned with something ancient and personal. "She's the reason I'm still alive," she said more to herself than to him. Her mind had already slipped backward to a day in 1996 when she'd been just a lieutenant visiting her niece's elementary school. The morning had been routine until a disoriented man with a shotgun stormed the building screaming about voices and vengeance. Chaos had erupted. Teachers had locked doors. Children had screamed. And then, in the middle of that chaos, Nadine Holloway had stepped into the hallway and stood between the gunman and the second-grade classroom without flinching. No vest, no training, just pure, unwavering courage. She had talked the man down, disarmed him without ever touching him. And when police finally arrived, Margaret Whitaker had watched from behind the glass of a classroom door as the woman now being dragged across a snowy parking lot had handed the shotgun over to an officer and returned to her students like it was just another Monday. That day had changed Whitaker's life. She'd promised herself that if Holloway ever needed her, the debt would be paid. And now, decades later, the call had come. "Get me the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and the Pennsylvania Governor's Office on 3 separate lines," she snapped to her aide. "We move in 15 minutes. I want internal affairs at that precinct before sunrise. And activate Eagle Response Protocol 7. This isn't local anymore." Back in Frostbridge, the snow had grown heavier, falling in thick curtains, as the cruiser turned off Main Street away from the police station. Nadine sat quietly in the back seat, wrists cuffed but posture erect, as if she were preparing to teach a lesson rather than face interrogation. Brenda drove in silence, but Kelly kept glancing into the rearview mirror, unsettled by the lack of fear in their passenger's eyes. "What's with the attitude?" she finally snapped. "You think someone's gonna save you?" Nadine tilted her head slightly, her voice gentle but sharp enough to cut through steel. "I think you've mistaken silence for surrender, Officer Monroe. That's your first mistake, and it won't be your last." Kelly looked away unnerved. Brenda turned up the radio to mask the awkward stillness, but it couldn't drown the truth hanging between them. They didn't know it yet, but they hadn't arrested a helpless woman. They had just awakened a promise made by one of the most powerful women in Washington. a promise that tonight would come due. The squad car pulled into the dimly lit rear entrance of the Frostbridge Police Department tires, crunching over frozen gravel, the engine's low growl the only sound amid the falling snow. Nadine Holloway remained silent in the back seat, eyes focused straight ahead, her expression unreadable, neither defiant nor submissive, but something deeper, something resolute. Brenda killed the lights, exchanged a look with Kelly, then got out and yanked open the back door. "Let's make this simple," she muttered, gripping Nadine's arm. But as the older woman stepped out, still cuffed, still poised, a black SUV turned the corner. No lights, no siren, just silent motion slicing through the darkness. It pulled up alongside them and stopped. The back window rolled down halfway, revealing a woman in a tailored overcoat with silver-streaked hair and eyes that radiated command. "Release her," the woman said flatly. Brenda blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me," came the answer, calm and unyielding. "That woman is under federal protection as of 5 minutes ago. Says who Kelly demanded, stepping forward, hand drifting toward her taser. Says General Margaret Whitaker." The woman replied, stepping out of the SUV and flashing a badge, not a local one, not even state. Department of Defense. And unless you want to add obstruction of a federal directive to your already fragile careers, I suggest you take your hands off Mrs. Holloway and step back. Kelly hesitated, but Brenda wasn't ready to fold. "This is our jurisdiction." She was disturbing the peace. "She disturbed your ego, not the peace," the woman snapped. "Now stand down." More black vehicles began to arrive, feds in dark suits filing out with coordinated precision, radios crackling, paperwork already in hand. The Frostbridge precinct lit up like a hornet's nest. Inside, officers murmured confused. Outside, the balance of power shifted beneath the snow. Raymond stood across the street, still in his apron, staring in disbelief. He had stayed after making the call, part instinct, part guilt. He hadn't expected anything. But now, watching as 2 federal agents gently removed the cuffs from Nadine's wrists and helped her into a waiting car, he felt something stir in his chest, a strange, fragile thing. Hope. Nadine glanced out the tinted window as they pulled away, her eyes meeting his across the street. She didn't smile, but she nodded once, soft, imperceptible, but filled with acknowledgement. Meanwhile, General Whitaker was already on a secure call, pacing inside a mobile command unit. "She's safe. Proceed with Phase 2. I want all records from the Frostbridge precinct, disciplinary files, body cam, archives, internal memos. Prioritize officers Hill and Monroe. And get me everything we have on Clean Site Realty and their relationship with law enforcement and rural municipalities. We've got something deeper here. I can feel it." Nadine sat quietly in the back seat, her fingers running over the red imprint the cuffs had left on her skin. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The avalanche had already begun. As the convoy carried her away from the small-town precinct, where dignity had been briefly chained and then swiftly liberated, Nadine Holloway sat still, her eyes unfocused, yet burning with memory. The low hum of tires on snowy asphalt faded beneath the weight of a single day 27 years earlier that had carved itself into the marrow of her life like a scar that refused to fade. It was spring then, a Tuesday like any other, the scent of pencil shavings and paste lingering in her classroom, where laminated posters about kindness and curiosity hung from brightly colored walls. The children were 7, some barely 6. Their hands always raised with questions about ladybugs spelling words and whether clouds could fall. She had just passed out juice boxes after math when the first scream rang down the hall, shrill and sharp like a snapped string. The principal's voice followed over the PA system, stuttering, uncertain, locked down. "This is not a drill." She didn't hesitate. She told the children to get under their desks, turned the lock on the door, and drew the blinds. Then she stepped back into the hallway because she heard a voice. A man's voice, rambling, angry, broken. She saw him 3 doors down, holding a shotgun, like it was a burden rather than a weapon, sweat beading beneath his camouflage jacket, eyes wide and lost. And beside him, paralyzed with fear, stood Margaret Whitaker. Then just a young Army lieutenant, volunteering in her niece's class for career day, still in uniform. The man had the gun pressed against her shoulder, his finger twitching on the trigger. Nadine remembered the moment as if it were happening now, the weight of her heels on the floor, the chill in her spine, the realization that no one else was coming. So, she walked, slowly, arms at her side. "You don't want to do this," she had said, her voice like warm syrup, calm, maternal, unshakable. "This isn't who you are." The man turned toward her, confused. "They laughed at me," he muttered. "Told me I was broken." She nodded, stepping closer. "Then, let's fix it together. Put the gun down. Let the kids go home safe tonight." She didn't blink, didn't tremble, and eventually, somehow he did. He lowered the shotgun, crying, and when officers arrived seconds later, it was Nadine who handed them the weapon and whispered, "He needs help, not punishment." That moment had never made national headlines, but it had saved 26 children, a teacher's aide, and one stunned soldier, who from that day forward carried the memory of Nadine's courage like a talisman in her chest. General Margaret Whittaker had never forgotten. That day had shaped her leadership, her policies, her sense of moral duty. And now, with the woman who once stood unarmed in the face of a loaded gun, once again under threat, this time by the very system she had spent her life serving, Margaret would burn every ounce of her political capital to return the favor. In a secure meeting room at the Frostbridge Federal Annex, Margaret leaned forward across the table, where Nadine sat sipping chamomile tea offered by one of the agents. Her voice was quiet, but every syllable was iron. "They touched you," she said. "That means they declared war on the wrong person." Nadine looked up, her eyes tired but fierce. "Don't make this about vengeance, Margaret. Make it about truth." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then help me find it." Nadine reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small manila envelope folded and creased from age. Inside were copies of emails, letters, and incident reports she'd quietly gathered over the years. Whispers of teachers, harassed retired civil servants, evicted aging workers priced out of neighborhoods bought up by a shadowy real estate firm named Clean Sight Realty. "I thought I was imagining it," Nadine said softly. "Until it happened to me. Then I knew. They're targeting anyone deemed unproductive. Anyone they think won't fight back." Margaret passed the file to her aide and stood. "Then let's show them how wrong they were." The morning after Nadine's rescue, the sky over Frostbridge remained low, and gray snow turning to sleet as the town trudged through another bitter day, unaware that the ground beneath it had already begun to shift. In a converted conference room inside the Frostbridge Federal Annex, General Whittaker stood at the head of a makeshift war table, flanked by federal agents, legal analysts, and her aide-de-camp, all now looping in to what was rapidly being designated as a national civil rights investigation. But it wasn't until the name Clean Sight Realty resurfaced that the room fell utterly silent. "They've been active in over a dozen towns like Frostbridge," the aide reported, tapping on a projected map dotted with red. "Each location shows a similar pattern: sudden enforcement spikes against seniors, the unhoused former educators and veterans, followed by property purchases at artificially depressed prices." Nadine, seated nearby, with a blanket over her knees and her hands clasped in her lap, didn't flinch. "They call it community revitalization. I call it quiet eradication." The mood darkened further when Agent Langston stepped forward with a file marked "Confidential." "We've discovered that Clean Sight isn't operating alone. They're coordinating with individuals inside law enforcement, particularly precincts led by command staff with ties to a group known internally as the Shield Men." General Whittaker's jaw tensed. The Shield Men, a rogue coalition of officers in small jurisdictions who'd built careers on cleaning up their communities under the banner of order, were long suspected but rarely proven. Until now. Brenda Hill and Kelly Monroe both attended the same tactical community training seminar hosted by a Clean Sight affiliated group. Last year, Langston continued. And they're not the only ones. We've identified 5 additional officers in Frostbridge with connections to this Shield Men network. Whittaker turned to Nadine. "You suspected this." For how long? Nadine's eyes flickered, haunted. "Years. I just didn't have the tools to prove it. I saw neighbors evicted for minor code violations. I saw former students, good kids, disappear after encounters with police. I spoke up once at a town hall. They told me I was paranoid, that I was aging poorly." Her voice didn't break, but the pain laced through every syllable. "And when I wouldn't stop asking questions, they canceled my tutoring contract, quietly, without a word." Raymond Miller, seated across the room, clenched his fists. "They didn't just try to erase her, they made it policy." Nadine turned to him, her gaze firm. "But now, we make it truth." Whittaker placed a hand on Nadine's shoulder with quiet reverence. "I need you to keep telling your story. Not just to me, but to the world. If we're going to take down CleanSight, if we're going to dismantle shieldmen, it has to start with something bigger than evidence. It has to start with moral clarity. Nadine nodded. Then it's time we stop whispering in corners. Let's bring them into the light. Outside, the storm had not relented, but inside, the winds had shifted. What began as one woman's quiet resistance had now grown into a coordinated federal operation. Files were being seized, internal memos subpoenaed, and a single ordinary town called Frostbridge was about to become ground zero for a reckoning decades in the making. The air inside the Frostbridge Police Academy lecture hall was heavy with tension, though the cadets seated in their neat rows barely showed it. Officer Kelly Monroe stood at the front arms, folded, speaking in the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who expected obedience without question. Community policing, she said, tapping the whiteboard with a marker, is about control. You can't protect a town if you don't first clean it. The phrase hung like smoke. In the back row, Jameson Miller, barely 21, sat still, his uniform pristine, his posture rigid, but beneath it all, his chest pounded. Beneath his shirt, taped between skin and duty, was a slim wire recorder provided by Agent Langston and authorized under emergency whistleblower protection. He had agreed to wear it just 48 hours ago after watching his brother Raymond break down while replaying footage of Nadine's arrest over and over again. Jameson had grown up worshiping the badge, but now he was starting to see what it meant when corrupted hands held it. Today's lesson was led not by instructors, but by officers Brenda Hill and Kelly Monroe themselves. Unofficial, off the record, the kind of indoctrination that happened behind doors no civilians ever saw. We're not talking about the law here, Brenda said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone used to impunity. We're talking about survival. You don't rise in this job by coddling the weak. You rise by doing what the community doesn't have the guts to admit needs doing. A few cadets nodded. Jameson kept his expression blank. Then the moment came. Brenda clicked on a projector, showing a blurred photograph of an elderly man on a park bench. David West, she said flatly. Schizophrenic, harassed customers outside Jensen's market, wouldn't respond to warnings. We had to engage. Someone in the front asked, "Didn't he die in custody?" Brenda smiled coldly. Paperwork called it misadventure. End of story. But Jameson remembered the rumors. A man found with bruises that didn't match the fall. A store owner's statement that vanished. And now, here they were using it as a training example. His stomach twisted. "So, what do we do if someone like Holloway resists?" another cadet asked. Kelly answered without hesitation. "You isolate them, undermine their credibility. If they push back, you escalate. Make it seem like they're the threat. Always." Brenda leaned in, her voice lower now. "Remember, shieldmen don't ask permission. We act. If you want to be part of this town's future, that's who you work with." And there it was, the name. Spoken aloud. Jameson pressed his palm against his chest, subtly confirming the recorder was still in place. That night, he drove straight to the federal annex, his pulse racing. When he handed over the recording to General Whitaker's team, the room fell into a stunned silence as Kelly's voice played clear and unfiltered. "Make it seem like they're the threat. Always." The evidence was undeniable, legally explosive. Nadine sat in the corner, listening with closed eyes. Each word, another confirmation of what she had endured, and another nail in the coffin of those who had tried to bury her in silence. When the audio ended, she opened her eyes and turned to Jameson. "You remind me of someone I used to teach," she said quietly. "He thought rules were sacred until he saw who was allowed to break them." Jameson's voice shook. "That someone is still learning, ma'am. But he's listening now." Whitaker stood and faced the team. "We take this to DOJ tonight. No more delays, no more shadows. It's time to pull the curtain." And with that, the wheels of justice turned from evidence whispered through a wire to an army of truth prepared to march. By sunrise the next morning, the air in Frostbridge had changed, not just in temperature, but in weight, like the town itself had exhaled something it could no longer hold. Though the streets were quiet, something was moving beneath the surface: fear rumors, resistance. Word of Jameson's betrayal had spread faster than anyone expected. Not officially, no name was released, no footage leaked, but the Shieldmen network was vast, and by nightfall their instincts had already drawn a line in the snow. That same evening, Rachel Holloway, Nadine's only niece, a schoolteacher herself, found her mailbox stuffed with red-inked threats. traitor family. One envelope read. Another held a photo of her entering the federal annex circled in black marker. We see you. Meanwhile, Nadine, though safe under protection, received word that her former apartment had been broken into. Her books, hundreds of them, were torn and strewn across the floor like a message. Nothing stolen, only dignity shattered. In a small motel just outside town, Raymond sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers tapping restlessly on his phone. Every time he posted a video explaining what had happened, the comments flooded in Liar. Washed up lunch boy. You were always soft. But there were others too. Messages from former students of Nadine's, from veterans she'd tutored, from townsfolk, quietly grateful someone had finally said enough. Ava Washington, the federal civil rights lawyer sent by Whitaker's team, had now taken full charge of the legal front. In her temporary office above the town library, she built a war chest of affidavits, footage, medical records, and now Jameson's audio. Yet for every file she added, another roadblock appeared. The local judge refused to issue warrants. The county clerk misplaced paperwork. CleanSight's lawyers flooded the DOJ with injunctions. And when Ava parked her rental outside a diner for lunch, someone keyed her car from end to end, leaving a jagged word etched into the door. Out. That night, as wind howled outside the federal annex and snow piled high against the windows, General Whitaker gathered the team. We underestimated them, she said plainly. This isn't just corruption, it's indoctrination. And they're panicking. Nadine looked up from the table, her eyes sharper than ever. That means they're desperate, and desperate people always make mistakes. At that exact moment, a phone rang. Ava answered, listened, then stood. That was Rachel, she said, face pale. Her classroom was vandalized. Someone spray-painted Liar's blood across the chalkboard. They've crossed another line. Raymond swore softly. Jameson, standing near the window, spoke without turning. They're trying to push us back into silence. Nadine stood slowly. Then we speak louder. General Whitaker nodded. No more playing defense. We go public. All of it. Within the hour, Rachel's footage from Nadine's arrest was posted to multiple national platforms, along with a detailed statement from Ava, a quote from Nadine, and still images from the police academy wire recordings. Raymond added a final caption. She stood up for children her whole life. Now we stand for her. By morning, it had over 1 million views. But Frostbridge, that once sleepy town, was now a powder keg. The next blow would not be digital. It would come in sirens and steel. The first explosion wasn't large, but it was loud enough to wake every resident within 6 blocks of downtown Frostbridge. At 12:43 a.m., a Molotov cocktail shattered the front window of the old Frostbridge Public Library, now repurposed into Ava Washington's temporary legal headquarters. Flames licked at the curtains and crawled toward the shelves. But by some miracle, or perhaps preparation, the sprinkler system activated before the fire could devour the evidence stored inside. 10 minutes later, while first responders were still on scene, a second fire broke out, this time in the parking lot of the Maple Diner, where Raymond had worked his last shift just 2 days earlier. His car, an aging blue Civic with a bumper sticker that read, "Teachers deserve respect," was engulfed before the fire department could even respond. And yet, even as fire crews arrived and federal agents sealed off the block, local police did nothing. Not one squad car from the Frostbridge precinct arrived. Not a single Shieldman officer showed up to assist. It was clear now, this wasn't just negligence. This was open declaration, a signal. The Shieldmen were no longer trying to hide in the shadows. They were daring anyone to stop them. Ava stood in the ashes of the library entrance, her coat soaked, her laptop bag clutched tight against her chest. "They want us afraid," she said to Whitaker, teeth clenched. "They want us to feel alone." But Whitaker didn't flinch. "Then let them watch us rise," she said, eyes cold with command. "This ends now." By sunrise, she had mobilized a rapid response team from the Department of Justice. Dozens of unmarked vehicles arrived in Frostbridge, housing federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and tech analysts flown in overnight. They set up base in a government-leased building on the edge of town, beyond Shieldman reach. Nadine, refusing to be silenced, insisted on giving her first live national interview, seated beside Ava on the morning segment of a major cable news broadcast. With snowy rooftops of Frostbridge behind her and a microphone clipped neatly to her coat, she looked into the camera and said with unshaking voice, "I taught for 40 years. I believed in community. I believed in accountability. What happened to me isn't unique, but what happens next must be. Across the country, Americans watched. Retired teachers wept. Veterans reached for their phones. Former students, now grown, shared the video with notes like, "She taught me to read." Now she's teaching the nation to fight back. But inside Frostbridge, retaliation surged. Rachel, still recovering from the threat to her classroom, found her tires slashed in the school parking lot. Jameson, who had gone into protective housing 2 nights earlier, received an untraceable burner message: "Cadets don't outlive captains." And when General Whitaker attempted to serve a warrant on CleanSight's Frostbridge office, she was met at the door by armed private security wearing tactical gear with no nameplates and cameras that had mysteriously stopped recording. "No entry without local jurisdictional approval," their lead operative said coolly. "This is private property." "Not anymore," Whitaker replied, producing a second document, federal seizure, signed by a district judge. "Step aside." Behind the steel and the money and the corporate shields, something cracked. In the files seized from CleanSight's local server room was a folder encrypted but not impenetrable. Its title, Initiative HARP. Inside were detailed memos, emails, maps. A strategy. Ava read the first line aloud, her voice trembling. "Homeless, aged, retired, problematic. They categorized us." Nadine whispered, her face pale. "They made us targets." Whitaker closed the folder, her voice low and furious. Not anymore. They had the names, the contracts, the payment trails. The shieldmen were no longer just bullies with badges. They were now evidence, and soon they would be defendants. But even as the tide turned, the storm was not over. Because in a town still simmering with old hate and fragile power, desperate men don't go quietly. They go for one last shot. And in Frostbridge, the final shot was coming. Fast. It began with silence. No sirens, no warning. Just a sudden eerie stillness across Frostbridge, as if the entire town had taken one collective breath and held it. Then a single shot cracking through the early evening air like thunder. Not downtown, not near the station, but outside a small community center on Sycamore Lane. The place where Nadine Holloway was scheduled to speak at a local youth event that had doubled overnight into a rally for justice. Inside, dozens of young students, some in high school jackets, others in elementary snow boots, were seated with signs that read, "My voice matters and justice for Ms. H." Ava stood near the stage. Raymond was checking sound cables. Rachel handed out hot chocolate. Nadine was due in 5 minutes. The shot didn't hit anyone, but it shattered a floodlight outside raining glass over the pavement where a child had just been standing. Screams erupted. Panic surged. Agents moved quickly, herding the students inside, securing exits. Whitaker, already on site in anticipation of threats, took command. "Find her!" she barked into her comms. "Where's Nadine?" She wasn't answering her phone. Ava's blood ran cold. "She left the annex 20 minutes ago," she said. "She should be here." And that's when Raymond's phone rang from a blocked number. He answered. A voice, gravelly low, distorted, came through. "You wanted truth," it said. "Come get her. Warehouse. 48 Riverbend." Then the line went dead. Whitaker didn't hesitate. "We go now." But Nadine, who had been intercepted just 2 blocks from the center, was already at Riverbend. Tied to a rusted chair in the middle of an abandoned textile warehouse, her glasses cracked, her coat soaked from snow that drifted through a shattered skylight. Across from her stood Captain Vincent Brick, the true architect of the Frostbridge Shieldmen. Face hardened by years of unchecked power, eyes twitching with desperation. "You should have kept your head down," he said, pacing. "You were a relic. We gave this town a future." Nadine, even bruised and bloodied, still held her spine straight. "You didn't build a future," she whispered. "You buried people and called it progress." Brick's fist slammed against a nearby table. "You don't get it, do you?" he shouted. "It was never about you. It was about order, structure. People like you, old fragile stuck in the past, get in the way." Nadine looked up slowly, blood at the corner of her mouth. "I taught for 40 years, she said, "and I've seen every kind of broken soul walk into my classroom. But none were ever beyond learning. Until you." Outside, Whitaker's team arrived silently. Echo and Trace Q's cyber team, now fully deployed in the field, had hacked the building's power grid, disabled surveillance, and tracked Brick's exact position via thermal scans. Ava, armored in bulletproof resolve, approached with Rachel beside her, flanked by tactical units. "We go in quiet. We go in fast," Whitaker ordered. "No weapons unless fired upon." Inside, Brick ranted louder, pulling out a pistol and pacing with fraying control. "They'll forget you," he spat. "You'll be a footnote." Nadine's reply was like a blade. "Then I'll be the footnote that unraveled you." In that moment, Echo gave the signal. The door burst open. Flashlights. Commands shouted. "Drop your weapon. Hands where we can see them." Brick spun, fired once. A flash, a scream, and then silence. Nadine still alive. The bullet had missed. Brick was tackled disarmed, cuffed his face in the cold dirt of a building he once used to break others. Ava rushed to Nadine, tears streaming as she cut the rope from her wrists. "You're safe now. It's over." But Nadine, voice barely a whisper, said not over, not until they all answer. Over the next 2 weeks, DOJ arrests swept through the state. 32 officers indicted, 5 clean site executives charged with conspiracy fraud and civil rights violations. Frostbridge's mayor resigned. The Shield men were dismantled publicly, completely, and with no room for shadows. Nadine testified from a wheelchair, calm, poised, unyielding. Her story, broadcast nationwide, became a lightning rod for federal reform. Congress passed the Holloway Act, mandating independent oversight in precincts with homeless-related arrests. Ava was named its lead counsel. Jameson returned to the academy, not as a cadet, but as an instructor of ethics. Rachel reopened her classroom. Raymond took over a new cafe inside the Turner Veterans Center. And Nadine. She returned to the community quietly, humbly continuing to teach. But this time, not just math or reading. She taught courage, voice, resistance. One snowy evening on the anniversary of her arrest, she sat again at that same booth in the diner where it all began. A young girl approached, notebook in hand. "Ms. Holloway," she asked shyly, "what do I do if someone tells me I'm not worth listening to?" Nadine smiled, warm and eternal. "You tell them I taught the world what happens when we listen." And somewhere in a town, once dark with silence, the lights burned bright again. Justice, slow and scarred, had finally arrived. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight with fists. She taught, right until the world finally listened. Nadine Holloway's story isn't just about injustice. It's about courage in silence, power in humility, and what happens when a nation finally stops looking away. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, comment, share. Tell us, have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly? Would you speak up? Because sometimes, one voice can bring down an empire and rebuild a better world. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, truth, and justice.